For 15 years, the promise remained buried beneath layers of royal silence, locked behind palace walls and whispered only in the private corridors of Windsor. But now, as the monarchy faces its most uncertain chapter since the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, Catherine, Princess of Wales, has finally revealed the vow she made to the late Queen about the future of the crown, a promise so personal, so consequential, that even senior aides reportedly feared what would happen if it ever became public. And according to palace insiders, that moment has finally arrived. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Long before she became the Princess of Wales, before the state banquets, before the relentless pressure of public expectation, Catherine was quietly building something far more important inside the royal household: trust. Reports suggest that during the final decade of Elizabeth's reign, the late Queen and increasingly viewed Catherine not simply as William's wife, but as someone capable of carrying the emotional weight of the institution itself. While headlines often focused on scandals, departures, and palace tensions, insiders whisper that Elizabeth spent years observing Catherine in silence, studying how she handled pressure, how she protected her family, and how she endured scrutiny without losing composure. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of royal circles that this quiet consistency deeply impressed the Queen at a time when the monarchy was becoming dangerously fragile from within. According to various interpretations of private palace meetings, the relationship between Elizabeth and Catherine changed dramatically during the Queen's later years. What once began as cautious royal mentoring reportedly evolved into something far deeper and more personal. Sources close to former palace staff claim the Queen became increasingly concerned about the future stability of the monarchy after years of internal conflict, public criticism, and family fractures that shook the institution's foundation. The departures of younger royals, the constant media wars, and growing questions surrounding the crown's long-term image allegedly weighed heavily on Elizabeth during the final stretch of her reign. But amid that uncertainty, Catherine quietly emerged as what several insiders now describe as the steady hand the Queen trusted most. The emotional turning point reportedly came during one confidential conversation in the Queen's final years, a conversation so sensitive that aides were allegedly instructed never to discuss it publicly. Different interpretations of the exchange describe Elizabeth speaking with unusual honesty about the burden of monarchy, warning that the crown could survive scandal, criticism, and political storms but not division from within. Palace administrative streams, ranging from former staff accounts to royal commentators, suggest the Queen read the emotional fracture inside the family more than anything else. And sitting across from her during that deeply private moment was Catherine, listening carefully as the monarch who had carried the crown for more than 70 years spoke not as a sovereign, but as a woman desperately trying to secure the future of the institution she had spent her entire life protecting. Reports suggest that Prince William witnessed part of the emotional exchange, though accounts differ regarding how much he actually heard. Some insiders claim William entered near the end of the conversation and immediately sensed the gravity of what had taken place. Others insist he later learned about the promise directly from Catherine herself. But nearly every version of the story agrees on one detail. Something changed afterward. Former aides allegedly noticed Catherine becoming even more disciplined, more cautious, and more emotionally guarded in public life. Royal insiders now claim the vow shaped her entire approach to duty, influencing everything from her silence during family controversies to her growing commitment to stability, continuity, and service above personal emotion. And perhaps that is why this revelation feels so explosive now, because it arrives during one of the monarchy's most uncertain periods in decades. With growing concerns surrounding King Charles III and mounting pressure on the next generation of royals, the resurfacing of this alleged promise has reignited questions about what Queen Elizabeth truly feared during her final years, and why she believed Catherine would one day become essential to protecting the future of the crown itself. What was once dismissed as quiet palace rumor is now being whispered openly by royal commentators, former staff members, and insiders who insist the late Queen saw something in Catherine long before the rest of the world recognized it. And as those whispers grow louder, one chilling possibility now hangs over the palace more heavily than ever before. That Elizabeth may have already known the monarchy's greatest test was still waiting ahead. But the promise itself was only the beginning, because what Queen Elizabeth allegedly asked Catherine to protect was far greater than titles, ceremonies, or even the throne itself. Behind the glittering balconies and carefully rehearsed royal appearances, Queen Elizabeth II spent her final years carrying a fear few outside the palace ever fully understood. According to insiders, it wasn't illness, scandal, or public criticism that haunted her most. It was the terrifying possibility that the monarchy itself could fracture from within. As the final years of Elizabeth's reign unfolded, reports of growing tension inside the royal household became impossible to fully contain. What once appeared to the public as a temporary family disagreement slowly evolved into something far deeper and far more damaging. Palace insiders claimed the departure of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle shook the foundations of the institution in ways the public never completely understood. Behind closed doors, according to royal commentators and former aides, there was increasing fear that public trust in the monarchy was beginning to weaken under the weight of relentless controversy, televised accusations, and growing division between senior royals. For Elizabeth, who had spent more than 70 years protecting the stability of the crown, the crisis was never simply about headlines. It was about survival. Reports suggest she feared the monarchy could endure criticism from the outside, but not emotional collapse from within its own bloodline. It was during this deeply uncertain chapter that Catherine, Princess of Wales, allegedly became one of the few calming forces inside the family. While public attention remained fixed on scandal and speculation, insiders whisper that Catherine quietly stepped into a far more significant role behind palace walls. Senior courtiers reportedly began noticing often Elizabeth relied on Catherine's presence during periods of tension, particularly during emotionally difficult gatherings where divisions inside the family became impossible to ignore. Unlike others who allegedly responded to pressure with confrontation or emotional withdrawal, Catherine was said to bring steadiness. Silence when silence was necessary. Patience when tempers escalated. And above all, an understanding that the institution had to come before personal frustration, no matter how painful the situation became. According to palace administrative accounts and various interpretations shared by royal historians, the late queen increasingly saw reflections of her younger self in Catherine, not because they were identical personalities, but because both women reportedly understood something fundamental about royal duty. Survival often required sacrifice and silence. Sources familiar with former palace discussions claim Elizabeth admired Catherine's restraint, particularly during ring moments when the monarchy appeared dangerously vulnerable to public instability. While others sought attention, Catherine allegedly focused on continuity. While public narratives shifted daily, she remained disciplined, measured, and careful. Those qualities, insiders now suggest, became incredibly important to Elizabeth during the final years of her reign. At the same time, reports indicate that both Catherine and Prince William were increasingly viewed inside palace circles as the monarchy's future anchors. The phrase reportedly surfaced repeatedly among courtiers concerned about the institution's long-term future. William represented continuity of the bloodline, but Catherine, according to several royal insiders, represented emotional stability. And for Elizabeth, emotional stability inside the royal family was not a secondary concern, it was essential to the crown's survival itself. Palace historians now claim the Queen quietly spent years preparing Catherine for future leadership, not through dramatic ceremonies or official declarations, but through private conversations, careful observation, and moments of personal trust rarely extended beyond the innermost royal circle. What makes these claims so emotionally powerful now is the growing belief that Elizabeth understood far earlier than most just how fragile the monarchy could become in the modern era. Reports suggest she recognized that public loyalty to the crown no longer depended solely on tradition, pageantry, or history. It depended on whether the family at its center appeared united, disciplined, and emotionally resilient during moments of crisis. And according to insiders, that realization is precisely why Catherine became so important to her in those final years. Not merely as a future queen, but as someone the late monarch believed could hold the institution together when the pressure became unbearable. But even as Catherine earned the Queen's trust, very few people understood the full weight of what Elizabeth was preparing her for behind the scenes. Because hidden beneath the carefully controlled royal routine was a private fear the Queen reportedly shared with almost no one, a fear connected not just to the monarchy's future, but to the emotional cost required to preserve it. And it was during one deeply private moment at Balmoral that the Queen is said to have spoken the words Catherine would carry with her for the next 15 years. It happened far from cameras, speeches, and state banquets inside Balmoral, surrounded by silence, rain, and the fading twilight of an era. According to multiple royal insiders, this was the moment Queen Elizabeth II looked directly at Catherine, Princess of Wales, and entrusted her with a responsibility that would quietly define the next generation of the monarchy. The atmosphere at Balmoral that evening was unlike anything the modern royal household had experienced in years. Insiders describe a setting stripped of ceremony, stripped of distance. Almost stripped of the crown's usual formality. Catherine was reportedly invited without the usual presence of senior aides, without the structured protocol that normally surrounds royal meetings of such importance. There was no announcement, no briefing, no expectation, only silence and the quiet understanding that something significant was about to unfold. According to interpretations shared by former palace staff, the Queen had reached a point where she no longer wanted layers of formality between intention and truth. What she needed was clarity. And Catherine, by all accounts, was the one person she believed could carry it. Inside that private moment, reports suggest Elizabeth spoke with a rare emotional openness, far removed from the composed public image she maintained for decades. She spoke of sacrifice not as an abstract royal principle, but as a lived burden. She spoke of endurance, of watching institutions bend under pressure but refusing to break. And above all, she spoke of protecting the institution itself, not through force or visibility, but through quiet stability when everything else begins to fracture. Those familiar with royal commentary often note that Elizabeth's greatest concern in her final years was not external criticism, but internal fragility. The fear that the monarchy could weaken not from enemies outside, but from emotional division within its own walls. It was during this deeply personal exchange that Catherine, according to insiders, was not treated as a visitor, or even a junior royal, but as someone being prepared for something far greater. The Queen allegedly viewed her not just as a member of the family, but as a stabilizing force for the future. Someone capable of holding emotional balance when others could not. Someone who understood that visibility is not the same as strength, and that silence can sometimes be the most powerful form of duty. The conversation reportedly carried a weight that neither formality nor titles could very often. It was direct, unguarded, and deeply human in a way the public rarely associates with monarchy. Later that evening, Prince William is said to have joined Catherine, and witnesses or insiders describe him as visibly affected by what had taken place. Some accounts suggest he understood immediately that the moment he was stepping into was not ordinary royal duty, but something closer to inheritance in its emotional form. Not inheritance of wealth or titles, but of responsibility that cannot be refused once spoken aloud by a reigning monarch. The mood that followed reportedly lingered heavily across the estate. Catherine, according to multiple interpretations, became noticeably quiet, withdrawn, not in distress, but in deep reflection, as though absorbing something far too large to immediately express. What makes this moment so significant, according to palace historians, is not simply that the Queen placed trust in Catherine, but the nature of what she entrusted her with. It was not a request for public duty or ceremonial obligation. It was something far more enduring, a promise centered on preserving dignity during crisis, maintaining stability when the institution is tested, and holding the emotional center of the family intact when external pressures threaten to pull it apart. Those who have studied Elizabeth's reign closely often argue that she understood a simple truth. Crowns are not lost in grand gestures, but in quiet fractures that go unnoticed until it is too late. By the following days, palace staff reportedly observed a subtle but unmistakable change in Catherine's demeanor. It was not dramatic, nor publicly visible in any obvious way, but those who worked closely with her described a deeper seriousness, a reinforced sense of duty that seemed to settle into her presence. Even her silence, they said, carried more weight than before. She was still composed, still steady, but something had shifted. As if the conversation at Balmoral had not only been remembered, rebird, but internalized as a permanent part of her identity within the monarchy. And yet, what remains most striking in the retelling of this alleged moment is not the promise itself, but the emotional burden attached to it. Because what Catherine agreed to was not simply to support the crown in moments of stability, but to endure its most difficult moments without letting it fracture. To remain steady when others may falter. To absorb pressure without allowing it to spill outward. To protect an institution that, at times, demands silence as its highest form of loyalty. But what made the promise so powerful was not just what Catherine agreed to do, it was what she agreed to endure in silence. For years, the public saw Catherine, Princess of Wales, smiling through ceremonies, hospital visits, royal tours, and relentless headlines. What they did not see, according to palace sources, was the enormous emotional burden she had allegedly been carrying ever since that private promise to Queen Elizabeth II. Behind the carefully controlled image of grace and composure, insiders suggest Catherine was navigating a constant internal struggle, balancing personal emotion with institutional expectation. Every public appearance, every quiet gesture, every measured silence reportedly carried the weight of something far greater than protocol. As she transitioned into the role of Princess of Wales, scrutiny intensified. The world watched her every move, but what remained invisible was the pressure building behind that composed exterior. According to palace commentators, this was not simply royal duty, it was endurance under unrelenting emotional demand. Reports suggest that with each passing year, Catherine became increasingly defined by restraint, not because she lacked voice, but because she understood timing. Palace insiders claim she often placed institutional stability above personal comfort, even when it came at a private cost. Moments of tension within the royal family were reported. Every lie handled with a calm precision that avoided escalation, even when emotions inside the household ran high. In public, she remained steady. In private, according to interpretations shared by former aides, she absorbed pressure that few around her fully recognized. During difficult periods within the royal household, Prince William is said to have leaned heavily on Catherine's judgment and emotional balance. Some insiders describe her as the grounding force during moments when uncertainty threatened to ripple through the institution. Not as a figure seeking control, but as someone quietly ensuring stability did not collapse under strain. Royal observers often draw comparisons between her composed resilience and the stoicism once associated with Queen Elizabeth herself, noting a similar ability to separate personal turmoil from public responsibility. Over time, the narrative around Catherine began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Royal commentators and historians now reinterpret many of her past decisions through the lens of that alleged private promise. Actions once seen as routine duty are now viewed by some as deliberate choices shaped by a deeper understanding of continuity and responsibility. Her public restraint, her careful avoidance of controversy, and her consistent emphasis on duty over visibility are increasingly seen not as coincidence, but as reflection of a guiding principle passed down from a monarch who spent a lifetime protecting the crown. Yet, even after the Queen's passing, Catherine reportedly refused to speak about the promise, carrying it instead as something unspoken but ever-present. Insiders claim it was not silence out of avoidance, but silence as commitment. A vow that was never meant for public consumption, only private endurance. But as time moved forward, that silence began to face new pressure. The monarchy entered a phase of renewed uncertainty, and with it came renewed scrutiny, both internal and external. Old tensions, once conquered, retained, began to resurface in new forms. And it was precisely this shift that would eventually force what had been buried in silence back toward the surface, because even the strongest promises are tested when the institution they were meant to protect begins to face its next defining crisis. So why reveal the promise now, after 15 years of absolute silence? According to royal insiders, The answer lies in the growing uncertainty surrounding the monarchy itself, a moment some within palace circles reportedly describe as the most fragile period since the abdication crisis generations ago. What was once a private vow, carefully sealed within the emotional space between Queen Elizabeth II and Catherine, Princess of Wales, is now being spoken of again because the institution around it is shifting under pressure in ways few could have fully anticipated. In recent months, concerns surrounding the health and long-term stability of King Charles III have intensified public anxiety about the future direction of the crown. According to reports from royal commentators and palace observers, this uncertainty has created a quiet but powerful recalibration inside the institution. Not panic, but preparation. Not collapse, but careful repositioning. Within that atmosphere, Catherine has increasingly been viewed not simply as a senior royal, but as a stabilizing force whose presence alone carries a sense of continuity that the monarchy now depends upon more than ever. Insiders suggest that this shift did not happen overnight. It has been building gradually, shaped by years of consistent public behavior, disciplined silence during controversy, and an ability to remain steady even when the institution around her appeared unsettled. Senior aides, according to various interpretations, are said to have encouraged a more visible leadership role for Catherine, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a strategic necessity in preserving public confidence. Because in moments when uncertainty rises, visibility becomes more than image. It becomes reassurance. At the same time, public perception has also evolved. After facing intense personal challenges in recent years, Catherine has drawn a wave of sympathy and respect that has only strengthened her position in the public imagination. Royal historians and commentators now argue that this emotional connection between the public and Catherine has become a crucial asset for the monarchy. Not in a political sense, but in a deeply human one. Trust, once shaken, is rarely rebuilt by institutions alone. It is often rebuilt through individuals who embody stability when everything else feels uncertain. Within palace circles, there are growing claims that Catherine's recent prominence is not accidental, but aligned with a long-term understanding of continuity that traces back to Queen Elizabeth herself. Some insiders suggest that Catherine has begun to frame her public role through the lens of that earlier promise, not as obligation, but as gift, a guiding principle. A quiet commitment to preserve dignity, stability, and emotional balance within the crown, even as the pressures surrounding it continue to evolve. This perspective has also influenced how her partnership with Prince William is now being interpreted. Reports suggest that both have entered a phase of preparation for a far more demanding royal future, one defined not only by ceremonial duty, but by institutional responsibility on a scale that few outside the palace fully understand. William represents continuity of succession. Catherine represents continuity of trust. And together, according to royal observers, they now form the central axis around which the future of the monarchy increasingly revolves. Yet even as this narrative gains strength, Catherine has reportedly remained deeply private about the promise itself. Insiders claim she has never used it publicly as justification, nor has she acknowledged it in any formal setting. Instead, it continues to operate as so, mething unspoken, shaping decisions quietly rather than being declared openly. That silence, however, is beginning to draw attention precisely because of what it suggests, that the weight of the past is still actively influencing the present. And as the monarchy moves closer to another defining chapter in its modern history, one question now lingers beneath every discussion and every carefully measured public appearance: what exactly did Queen Elizabeth say in those final moments that transformed a private promise into a guiding force for an entire generation? Because the most emotional part of the story was still hidden, because the final words Elizabeth allegedly said to Catherine would forever change how she viewed the crown. According to multiple interpretations circulating within royal circles, Queen Elizabeth II's final message to Catherine, Princess of Wales, was not about power, wealth, or prestige. It was far simpler and far heavier. Protect the heart of the crown, no matter what it cost you personally. Those words, as they are now repeatedly described by insiders and royal commentators, were never delivered like a public instruction or formal royal directive. Instead, They are said to have been spoken in a moment stripped of ceremony, where titles mattered less than truth. Reports suggest Elizabeth had long understood that the survival of the monarchy would not depend on grandeur or tradition alone, but on emotional endurance inside the family itself. Service above popularity was not just a philosophy she lived by, it was the burden she believed would one day be inherited by those who came after her. And in that inheritance, Catherine reportedly found herself confronted with something far heavier than expectation. According to interpretations shared within palace circles, the Queen's warning carried an unmistakable gravity. Future storms inside the family were not a possibility, but an inevitability. The monarchy, she implied, would not always be protected by unity. There would be fractures, misunderstandings, and moments where loyalty would be tested not by public pressure, but by private strain. In that context, protecting the crown was not about image, it was about holding its emotional center together when everything around it began to shake. Sources close to royal observers claim that Catherine was deeply moved by the weight of that request. Not in a dramatic or visible way, but in a quiet internal shift that those around her later noticed. It is said that the words lingered far beyond the moment they were spoken, settling into her understanding of what her role truly meant. The idea that monarchy survives through sacrifice rather than glamour reportedly became a defining lens through which she viewed her public responsibilities. Every gesture, every appearance, every silence began to carry a deeper sense of intention. Prince William, according to palace interpretations, immediately understood the seriousness of what had been passed on. Those familiar with royal dynamics suggest that he recognized not just a message, but a generational transfer of responsibility, one that tied the future of the institution to emotional resilience as much as constitutional duty. In that understanding, Catherine was no longer simply a senior royal, she was being positioned as a stabilizing presence in moments when stability itself might become rare. In the days and years that followed, palace aides reportedly described Catherine as becoming more determined than ever, though not in a visible or outspoken sense. Instead, her determination expressed itself through restraint, precision, and an unwavering focus on preserving dignity even during moments of internal or external pressure. The phrase, "protect the heart of the crown," began to circulate quietly among those familiar with her role, not as a slogan, but as a principle that seemed to guide her choices in subtle but consistent ways. Royal insiders now claim that this promise has never faded into history. Instead, it continues to echo through decisions made behind palace walls, shaping responses to challenges both seen and unseen. Whether in moments of public difficulty or private tension, the guiding weight of those alleged final words remains, according to some interpretations, quietly present an invisible framework shaping how duty is understood and carried forward. And as the monarchy moves toward an uncertain future, many now believe Queen Elizabeth saw something in Catherine long before the world fully recognized it. Long before public opinion shifted decisively in Catherine's favor, Queen Elizabeth II reportedly already believed that Catherine, Princess of Wales, represented the monarchy's most stable path forward in an increasingly unpredictable world. Not because Catherine demanded attention, but because she consistently refused to be consumed by it. According to royal commentators and palace insiders, Elizabeth's admiration for Catherine was never rooted in spectacle or charisma. Instead, it was discipline, control, and something far rarer inside the modern royal machine: emotional steadiness under pressure. While others were drawn into visibility, Catherine was noted for restraint. While narratives around the monarchy shifted rapidly in the public eye, she remained anchored in consistency. That, insiders suggest, was what the late Queen valued most: not loud presence, but quiet reliability. Over time, observers began drawing comparisons between Catherine and the late Queen herself, particularly in terms of composure and continuity. Royal analysts and commentators often described her as embodying a modern interpretation of traditional royal restraint, someone who understood how to evolve the image of the monarchy without destabilizing its core identity. In that balance between tradition and adaptation, Catherine began to represent something increasingly rare within the institution: continuity without disruption. 3 years passed, the public perception of Catherine also began to shift in a steady, almost understated way. Trust built slowly, not through dramatic moments, but through consistency. Her public role expanded, yet it never felt forced or performative. Instead, it appeared measured, deliberate, and deeply aware of the institution she was serving. According to interpretations shared within royal commentary circles, this gradual rise in public confidence mirrored what had already been observed privately within palace walls long before the wider world caught up. At the same time, reports suggest that younger members of the royal family began to look toward Catherine as a stabilizing figure within the broader structure of the monarchy. Not as a figure of authority in the traditional sense, but as someone whose judgment and emotional clarity could be relied upon during moments of uncertainty. This subtle shift in internal dynamics, according to insiders, reinforced her position as more than a senior royal. She became a quiet reference point within the evolving family structure. Within palace discussions, Catherine is often framed as someone who understands a principle that has defined the monarchy for generations. That survival depends not on attention, but on restraint. Royal insiders claim that Elizabeth valued this quality above almost all others, particularly in the final phase of her reign, when the pressures on the institution were at their most complex. Charisma may attract public interest, but it is quiet duty, they argue, that preserves continuity when the spotlight fades. As this perspective deepened, the relationship between Prince William and Catherine began to take on even greater symbolic weight. Many royal observers increasingly compare their partnership to earlier royal pairings defined by balance and shared responsibility, suggesting that their combined public presence reflects both continuity and adaptation within the modern crown. William represents institution, universal inheritance, while Catherine represents emotional equilibrium. Together, insiders argue, they form a dual anchor for a monarchy navigating constant change. What makes this narrative even more compelling, according to palace interpretations, is the way Catherine has been perceived in relation to change itself. Rather than resisting modernization or accelerating it recklessly, she is often described as someone capable of guiding transition without destabilization. That ability to evolve without fracture is now frequently cited by commentators as one of the most valuable traits within the modern royal structure. And so, over time, what began as quiet observation from Queen Elizabeth is now interpreted as something far more significant. A belief that Catherine represented continuity between generations of royal women. A living thread connecting past discipline to future stability. A symbol not of transformation alone, but of controlled, purposeful evolution. But perhaps the most very traumatic part of this story is that Catherine never intended for the promise to become public at all. 15 years ago, inside the fading silence of a royal estate, a future queen allegedly made a promise to a dying monarch. At the time, almost nobody knew it happened. Today, that promise may explain everything about the woman Catherine, Princess of Wales, has become and the kind of queen many believe she is preparing to be. What began as a quiet, almost invisible moment behind palace walls has slowly transformed into something far larger in meaning. According to royal insiders and longtime commentators, Catherine's journey from a relatively unknown newcomer to one of the most influential figures within the modern monarchy was never accidental. It was shaped by years of observation, pressure, and an unspoken responsibility that allegedly traces back to that private promise made to Queen Elizabeth II. Every step she has taken since then, every moment of restraint, every carefully measured, every assured public appearance, every silent response during periods of intense scrutiny has now been reinterpreted through the lens of that single defining commitment. As the years passed, what once looked like simple loyalty began to resemble something deeper. Insiders suggest that Catherine's discipline was never just personality, it was purpose. Her ability to remain composed during public storms, to avoid escalation during internal tensions, and to maintain dignity even when the pressure intensified, is now often seen as a reflection of the values the late Queen allegedly wanted preserved, not as a performance of royalty, but as a continuation of its emotional foundation. In that sense, Catherine did not simply adapt to royal life, she absorbed its weight and carried it forward with a quiet consistency that increasingly mirrors the legacy of Elizabeth herself. Within palace circles, there is a growing belief that this continuity is not symbolic alone. It is structural. The partnership bet. Queen Catherine and Prince William is now frequently described as the stabilizing core of the monarchy's next chapter. Together, they represent more than succession, they represent balance. William carries the inheritance of the crown, while Catherine embodies its emotional endurance. And in a modern age where perception can shift faster than tradition can adapt, that combination has become central to how the monarchy maintains its relevance and resilience. Royal insiders now frame the revelation of the promise as something almost historical in weight, not because it changes the monarchy's structure, but because it reframes its emotional continuity. What was once private has become symbolic. What was once hidden has become interpretive. And in that shift, Catherine's public identity has taken on an almost narrative quality, where each decision is viewed not in isolation, but as part of a longer, unfolding legacy. A legacy that reportedly began in quiet conversations long before the world ever recognized its significance. Public fascination around Catherine has only intensified as this interpretation has grown. She is no longer seen only as a senior royal performing duties, but as a figure of endurance, someone whose strength is defined not by visibility, but by steadiness under pressure. In an era where institutions are constantly questioned and reevaluated, that form of resilience has become rare, even powerful. And according to royal observers, it is precisely this quality that makes her presence so central to the monarchy's evolving identity. As the institution steps into a new era shaped by both modern expectations and deeply rooted tradition, the alleged promise between Catherine and Queen Elizabeth is now viewed as a thread connecting two generations of royal philosophy. One rooted in duty, one carried forward in silence. And together, they form a continuity that many believe defines the monarchy's survival in a rapidly changing world. Because in the end, the own was never simply about power, it was about endurance, sacrifice, and the silent promises made behind palace walls long before history ever hears about them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.